All right, our next big thing that was requested was fur, scales, and feathers on a body. Now, it gets really interesting with feathers because how you draw feathers on a body can either end up you'll end up using a lot of shorthands for scales like you would feathers, or you end up using a lot of shorthands like fur for feathers. First off, to get started, I'm going to draw a cylindrical shape, like so. And let us just say that this is a segment of a snake. Now, the easiest way, and this technique can be used for both feathers and scales. If we're doing scales more like what snakes have, what dragons would have, this is a really good method for it. I have already shown you how to do the crocodile scales, but I will do that over again. And for those of you who might be thinking along the lines of dinosaurs, there is, like, we don't know what they look like, so it is kind of your own choice of how to depict them. They could have had lizard scales, they could have had alligator, they could have had snake type scales, they could have had a combination of feathers and scales. With your creatures like that, it gets a little bit more interesting and a whole lot up to whatever the viewer or not the viewer, the artist wants to do at the time, which makes it really, really intriguing. And I got a cat who's being a bad boy. Because there is no set rules. They might have been alligatory on top and gotten more lizard-like skin as they went down along the sides. We don't know. There are some impressions from fossils that have shown some possible scale patterns, maybe what their skin looked like, but it's only like for one tiny little section like this big on when you think of something as giant as a T-Rex, are possible skin samples like this size. And they're finding out all the time that, like, what they used to think was its own species of dinosaur is actually the immature version of an older dinosaur, and so on and so on. So who knows? That's kind of like one of those things where up to your own artistic license how you want to go about doing it. Now, as far as adding scales to something that's fairly close up, and let me go ahead and extend this so that way we have a little bit more of an idea for a real body. So, let's say the top line kind of ends about like this, so the snake is kind of curled in on itself, more or less. And I'm going to take this line, and I know this is not the dead top. This line is actually the dead top of it. I'm going in really, really lightly, and that is going down the middle top of this snake, or whatever it is. Then this line, and you want to keep the lines to be fairly evenly spaced from each other. Now, there are exceptions to that, obviously, like particularly around mouth areas. But when you have just basically a long segment of body that's not doing a whole lot, like for instance a snake, there's not a whole lot of deviation other than getting closer together and getting further apart from its own self as it's folding in on itself. But down here, all right, now we have our basic lines. And about in here, again, I'm trying to keep all of these evenly spaced as I go. So now we have a straight noodle. And from here, this is how I can move and rotate my scales around by using this grid method. Some people will use, and this also works for fish as well, some people will also do this little ditty here, so that way they know exactly how they want their scales to be in size. But when you're doing your scales like this, with this curvature, you're going to have a lot more to erase, for starters. And you are going to end up with areas that are going to get filled in with scales that are going to be like half scales. Like, for instance, where this line is intersecting with this line here. Horizontal versus perpendicular. And this can be a great way to put on scales and being able to get the curve. And as we know, as something moves through space, even if I kept these curves the same, Let me turn it this way so it's a little easier for me to put in. Yes. So quickly drawing this out, they're pretty much evenly going the same, but now we've gotten around this curved part of the body. Now things are going to change. We know that this noodle, this round shape, is going to bend through space. So these circles going around are going to change. Just gradually at first, they're going to be narrower at the top and wider at the bottom. Because I drew this dark line in here earlier, so that way I knew where the top line, or where the side of it was going in. This area gets narrower and narrower, but this area in here should never be larger than what you've already been putting in, or shouldn't. It can totally get bigger than that. But then you're going to have to deal with gaps in the scales, in between the scales. Thought that paper felt a little thick. Now, because the snake is still scrunched up in here, you're still going to have more smaller areas and gaps there than you are in other areas, until everything pretty much evens right back out. Like so. And from there, again, it's just filling in your scales and trying to get them uniformly shaped and getting them uniformly the same. So for instance, this one's going to have to get moved over just a little bit in order to touch the next one. And then as you move through, because these areas end up being so much smaller, so my second layer that was only halfway up, that means in this square it's got to be halfway up. And this allows you to bend things with your curves. So that way you can kind of keep everything on point. Now, I personally have never liked doing it as a grid. I just like following the lines. So that way I can customize the scales however I want and to do whatever I want. So I'm going to just do it the normal way I do it rather than the way other people have done it. But I just want you to be aware that that is a possibility, because the biggest problem normally is following the body shape and scrunching up what things need to be scrunched up and where and when and why. And then we can see it going around the body here. And even, you may think, like, especially with snakes, their scales are always smooth and glassy, and they are. They're always very smooth against their body. But once the longer scales start to bunch up where they have bent themselves, it does become a little rougher. I do own a ball python, and I have observed and watched him move and how his scales move and how they bunch and how they separate. And in a place where, for instance, we'll take this section and rotate that. So this is the top of the spine. Here's the body of it. So that's the side view there. Draw my lines in. Like so. Now, if we did use this grid method here, this would definitely show you where the gaps would end up being. Yeah, let's see. These gaps would end up getting further and further apart because, you know, we're going around this body here. Because just as they get smaller over here, they get larger as they face you. So, a cake donut, pretty much at this point. And where all these were nice and uniform over here, we're not going to end up with that as much. There's going to be a lot more spaces and a lot more gaps. And let's see here. Let's say there was a scale right here. But earlier, good Lord, guys. In order to do this, technically this scale ends right here. Like, this is skin, this is flesh in this area. I'll just darken that in so you can see it. Normally it's pink, or pinkish, I guess. It depends on what species of snake we're talking about. But I'm just going to darken that area in right there. This is skin that will poke out in between the scales. Some reptiles it's going to be more dramatic. Some it's not going to be as dramatic. Some will have bigger scales. Now, as far as scales that you can do, you got the normal, simple, glossy guys, kind of pretty much just leaf shaped. Then you can add a little bit more armor to them, make it larger. You put a kind of a leaf down in here, but then if you start shading it, it kind of gives it a feeling of depth, that this part is raised. Like so. And then you got rounder scales. You got your classic fish scale. Very uniform looking. Well, all scales are pretty much very uniform looking, but even a fish can't, or at least that I've seen, a fish with scales can't bend so much that you can see the gaps in the armor. Not easily. They don't do yoga like snakes do. And you just got your classics, and say you start off simple, the simple scale, and maybe it gets closer and closer towards the back, and then the scales get bigger. Now, this is more on the fantasy side where the scales are getting bigger, because normally it's a very uniform look in reality. Like so. Now, the only time when it's not uniform, and this is where, like, it's kind of like with birds, how scales form around a head and a face, that's where you're just going to have to look up different reptiles, because every reptile and every species, how their scales are constructed on their face is completely different from another. It ends up being more plate-like, a little bit more crocodile-like, because other than, like, around the jaw area, the head, you know, the skin on the head and everything doesn't move that much, so it's more armor than it is chain link. But, you know, you got your pretty typical stuff where you have an eye, reptile eye. You got this classic brow look where you're just sweeping in with scales and lining an area with scales. And pretty much when it comes to head scales, however they look, however you want to armor them, that's pretty much kind of up to you how you go about doing that. You got the mouth area. That tends to be a pretty typical area to do the rectangular shape to show off, which is a very lizard style look. Just throw some teeth in there so that way you can kind of see what I'm getting at. And then there is the completely lipless look, which is more like your alligators and stuff. And that's been the big debate. Did dinosaurs, did they have lips or did they not? Lips, you got more of your lizards, crocodiles. Let's see here. And then the teeth just come straight out of the mouth area. There are no lips for them to hide behind, so you got to put a hoop and a tooth. A hoop and a tooth. More or less. That's lipless versus not lipless when you dealing with crocodiles and alligators and blah, blah, blah. Now, unless the texture is a key focus in your piece, you're probably, like, for instance, if you're doing a very large animal in a very small drawing, like, for instance, and I'm saying dinosaurs a lot because, like, other than snakes and lizards, people know what a snake looks like. People know what a lizard looks like. If I say a ball python, not all of you are going to know exactly what that looks like versus a rat, snake versus this versus... There's so many, but when it comes to reptiles, it's snakes, lizards, dinosaurs. So that's where a lot of the comparison or why I'm using dinosaurs a lot, because you also have the sense of bigness that a lot of our reptiles today don't have. So, it gives me more examples. So when it comes to, for instance, if I was going to draw a T-Rex and I was only going to draw it on a piece of paper this big, I am not going to draw every single scale. That is too much. And I don't care. Anything that is humanoid size and you are drawing it on a sheet of paper like this, the regular computer paper, don't draw every scale. Don't draw every little detail. It gets to be too much. It gets to be over the top, and it just ends up being, even if you did it to scale for the animal, it ends up not looking like scales at all. When it comes to something that big, that's where implied detail comes in. Let me go ahead and show you alligators real quick. So we got the top ridge of an alligator, roughly. I don't have a photo of an alligator to look at, so I'm just kind of doing these little, we know they have that row of spiky parts along the top of their back, so I'll just, not quite that extreme, but there we go. Like so. And then you kind of just wiggle down. Now, crocodiles, they don't move tons. Not like how a snake will move and fold in on itself. An alligator pretty much moves left and right. They don't have a lot of reason to go upwards and bend their back backwards like my hand here. They don't do this like snakes do, and snakes even do it way more extremes. So because of that, their scales are designed completely differently. They're designed for them to be able to move side to side. And when you do see an alligator pointing upwards, that's because they've shot up out of the water. But they move side to side rather than up and down so much. They're pretty stiff little boards. Again, they don't attend yoga very much. So for a more alligator-like look, just kind of start with these downward lines. And then you just kind of break it in a little bit, and you can break them up. And again, this was in the Phoenix drawing class. And I can make these just about any size I want. I can break them up a little bit, but you want, especially up near the top where they need the most armor, it's going to be bigger chunks, bigger scale areas. And I'm just kind of making this up. Now, these lines that you do put down, you don't want to break over them, but rarely. So, for instance, as rare as if I were to draw this whole alligator in, for this section of 3, this might be the only place where I end up breaking over this line. Because that adds a little bit of sense of variety. And even within these areas, there might be more lines that some of the scale patterns will follow. And as you move down the side of the alligator, the smaller and smaller these little patterns start to get. And now every space in between ends up looking a lot like a or not ends up looking like, it is where basically the soft squishy skin is. So maybe a little narrow one here, but we are following that line. And you can make some that are taller than others. Maybe there's another little narrow one here. But you really, really want to follow this grid pattern. And maybe this one's taller and there's a bigger gap of flesh right there. And then it just keeps going and going until it kind of just devolves into pebble rock shapes the further down you go. And they just smaller, bigger gaps in between, and so on. So that's more of your alligator style look. Now when it comes to, this is my cobalt here. Now she is going to have scales. I want to portray that she is a scaly creature, but I'm not going to draw in every single teeny tiny scale. That's going to detract from the face, from the cuteness. Is like, or what's more important, the expression, the what do you call it, the pose, the sense of character and personality. All of these things are way more important than putting every single teeny tiny scale on her body. It just ends up detracting from. So I'm going to just highlight key areas with implied detail. So I'm going to give her some more crocodilian style scales around some key features like the eyes. That you end up with a lot of reptilian stuff around there. And she don't need much more than that right there. Now, what I was talking about with that pebbling, and I see a lot of people who do dinosaurs this way, is that they will pick a few areas where they will put in some random shapes and just dot them around a little bit. Already, that is implying that she has scales more than just around her eyes. Now, let's see here. Maybe she has a bit more scaliness going on right here. Kind of like armor on her forehead. And then I'm going to do a bit of more of a crocodile style jaw where we have those lines coming around. And then I will fill in those areas to make her feel a little bit more crocodilian. And maybe these other areas along her body, like especially along her tail here, might put groups of 3. And you normally want to do odd numbers. And there you go. That is all the more implied detail. A person's eye is going to see something as simple as this. Well, it's not feathers, it's not fur, so what other option could it be? Well, if it was skin, it would be smooth, so it has to be scales. Especially with the information that we've given around the eyes about the scales that are going on down the nose. I've given so many small areas to say scaly, scaly, scaly animal, that I don't need to cover the entire thing in scales. And I do believe, and if not, this is a mythical creature, so I do have the artistic license to not do it this way if I don't want to. I do believe crocodiles, the further and further you get along the jaw here, the smaller and smaller those squares and rectangles will become. If it's not true, that's okay. That's what I'm going to do to maybe she's a little bit different that way from being purely too crocodile. And honestly, she looks a little bit Pokemon-ish to me, so I might even fiddle fart with this a little bit more. Totodile, I think's the Pokemon. And you can see that these are kind of this really strong line going around. It's a little bit too strong, so I might even put another line that only stops like about right there. And actually, we can even look at iguanas. Iguanas will have this one great big scale in the middle of their jaw. Why not try that? And then I will design these scales around that jaw. And then they just kind of taper away. And there you go. That's all the more implied detail that I need to say that this creature is scaly. Now, we got this fringe going on here that makes her feel a little bit birdish, which again, going back to dinosaurs, we've discovered so many things now where very easily they could have had feathers and scales, or proto-feathers, what have you. There we go. So I made that choice. Now I'm going to show you feathers. Now feathers and we're not going to go into the wing feathers. Wing feathers can be done exactly like how we did this snake here. If you're having a problem rotating the feathers, feather, feather, that's where when I was showing you how to do the lines earlier. All right, the feathers are supposed to point this way. All right, well then the next row needs to point this way. Next row needs to point that way. Next row needs to point that way. That way. If you make sure the bottom, or even doing it like this, so that way your feathers point in the direction you want them to point. Exactly the same as using the serpent body. Let me just double check. Yep, that was in frame. Good. Okay. So pretty much exactly how you'll go about doing the serpent body. So if you're having a hard time rotating your feathers around, draw your lines. The feather points this way, goes this way, goes this way, and you rotate that line. So pretty much a very similar premise. When feathers, and especially the way I drew these feathers, is not that far off from how I drew these scales. Normally when people look at the overall animal, that's when they start determining, oh, this is a bird. These are feathers because this is in the shape of a bird. These are scales because this is in the shape of a snake or a crocodile or blah. What have you. Insert animal here. The more detailed and the more you start refining things, the more it's going to really be a lot more complicated than that. But for now, getting started. Now, there are two ways you can do feathers on the body. Like, for instance, if we were to picture an owl or go and find a photo of an owl, you will see that each feather on the body has a particular pattern to it. So if I round face, big eyes, whoo, there we go. I'm not looking at any photos of owls. This is just a rough sketch. For a bird like that has a lot of texture, a lot of ink, a lot of lines, and a lot of everything just with the color of our feathers, we're going to use the exact same method as we did with the snake. You follow the lines along the body. Let's say here's the wing. You study, you look at a photo of them, you study how the feathers go across their body, because depending on how the bird moves, when the bird moves its head, how it looks, it is better to work from a photo. Nobody's brain can draw something realistically just from a memory. And this is something that really helped me a lot as far as my artwork and drawing realistically. Working from reference photos is extremely important until you have drawn something to death from every single angle and basically spent hours trying to draw a cat with its paws wide open and they're licking, they're cleaning the inside of their feet. You got to draw that 20 times before you will be able to draw that from memory, exact, and being able to change slight things, like maybe one toe's extended longer than all the other toes is, or, ooh, that feels real good kind of a thing. It takes time, and it takes a ton of practice. I grew up with horses. I was raised around horses ever since I was probably about 6. And I have spent 30 years of my life with horses. I wasn't able to draw horses. And I mean, we are talking show horses where I had to look at a horse and evaluate, okay, your legs are too long, or your legs aren't proportional to this. This horse needs a bigger butt to be a show horse. This horse needs more neck muscle. This horse needs more shoulder muscle. Yada, yada, yada. Just visually, I spent my whole life with show horses, picking them apart, piece by piece, muscle by muscle, just by visually looking at them. This horse travels weird. Why does it travel weird? Well, it's because it's limping. Okay, where is it favoring it? It's up in the upper knee on the back left leg, in the flank area. Okay, I've determined that this horse is in pain. We need to go and get them to a vet or get a doctor to come out and look at him. A lot of this stuff is really important when you're breeding horses and you're showing horses. So I really wasn't able to draw horses probably until I was 15, starting from 6 years old. And I could draw them from memory because I had been around so many horses. We had 150 at one point in time. Now these are miniature horses, so they're like basically Labrador sized. We had about 150 of them. I knew them all extremely well. I knew them by sight. I knew them by sound. I knew how each one had a different jaw shape, just like with people. They all have different face shapes. And I knew these animals so well after forever, essentially. 11 years of working with them, drawing them, studying them. In my life, 24/7 just about. It took 15 years to do. 14, 15 years. So when it comes to, okay, I just want to draw snakes, well, you got 14 to 15 years of different breeds and kinds of snakes to study and learn and draw and draw and draw and draw and draw. And if I were to basically challenge all of you to draw your mom and dad right now without looking at them from memory, you will forget something. And you've known them your whole life, but you've not drawn them. You've not picked them apart. You've not studied them your whole life. There's a big difference. There will be something you will forget. Maybe it's that mole that's just right beside their ear, and you know that mole. Why would you have forgotten to draw that? It looks like a little vampire bite, like just right beside their ear. Or maybe more appropriate, it's like two little moles near their neck, and it's like, it always reminds you of a vampire bite. How could you forget that? Kind of a thing, There are always little subtle details, and it takes years and years of practice to get to the point where you can draw without a photo. And I have a cat who's tearing things to pieces underneath my desk. Hello, baby. Would you please quit that? I know you want attention. Shoo. Yes, shoo. So, hence why my owl, from memory, pardon the language, sucks. But, as far as how things fall from the bird itself, how the feathers fall, how they lay, especially with these textured style feathers, you're going to need a photo. You can't just do it from memory or from your own brain. You have to look at reference photos. I have drawn dragons for years and years and years. I love drawing dragons. And I have drawn scales for years and years and years because I love doing it. And I love drawing dragons, and I wanted to give them all kinds of looks. So I can do all this from memory. This is easy for me. Textured, colorful bird feathers, not so much. I have there's another one I'm going to show you after this though. But it's exactly the same as before when it came to the scales. So that way you get the same look. They make sure that they shorten up where they're supposed to shorten up. They get bigger where they're supposed to get bigger. And then whatever pattern there is to these body feathers, you got to repeat it over and over. Whoo and whoo. And then you're going to start coming up with stupid things to keep you entertained while you're filling in said pattern over and over and over. And over. And you're just going to keep following whatever that bird has going on. Now this is really super textured birds. For the birds that are basically one solid color, like your eagles, your birds of prey, your raptors, and I mean raptors as in hawks and eagles and such, as opposed to velociraptors. Those birds are a lot easier to do because it's one uniform look, and by looking at them, unless you are right up on top of this bird, you can't see each individual feather. But with something like an owl that has a feather that has a very particular pattern, a very particular texture to it. Not that it really actually has a texture, but there is a pattern that feels like a texture because a lot of them are trying to look like bark on a tree. So that's where the texture thing's coming in. Dyslexia is fun. Let's just say it that way. So when it comes to body feathers, for something that's a little bit more on the solid side, raptors are a lot easier for me to go about and do because I draw a lot more raptors. He's wearing a hood for the time being. Vaguely raptor shaped. All right, so when it comes to something like that, what the most important parts of conveying this animal is feathery. One, the wings are going to do 90% of telling your audience this is a bird. So then we don't have to worry about filling in every little detail here. That ends up just like with like if you were trying to draw this great big dinosaur on this teeny tiny sheet of paper and you're drawing each individual scale. Well, one, these scales are so tiny that if it was proportional to the actual thing on your paper, you're not going to see those individual pieces, those individual parts, unless you are physically right up on top of it. And at that point, whatever bird you're drawing is probably to scale on the page, if you're really wanting to show that. So it's not important necessarily to tell all that information. So I just work on the outside line areas, the areas that tell people what the shape is. And this is where feathers being drawn like fur come into play, because now we're on the other end of that. And these are the exact lines I also use to draw fur. What ends up making it say, oh, this is feathers, is these big wings on this bird, or the shape of the head. Birds are very iconic. You can't confuse a bird with a moose. It doesn't happen. So you get the shape right, you're not going to have to worry about all that detail. And normally the fun is in the wings. So I just, for this little area, I got a swoop, made it go backwards just a little bit, and then came down from here. I'm just drawing a larger version of what I just did, so make sure you guys can see everything. Come in there. Yep. And then swoop. I make all kinds of noises whenever, whenever I'm doing stuff like this. Swoop, whoop, and spelunk. And that's my feathery look. This works really good for chickens. If you want a much smoother look, which I'm going to do a little bit more over here. Something a little bit more like this, where it's just long, sweeping, close lines. And these lines are all describing the shape of this animal. That it's fairly smooth. Because, I'm not going like this. It's all the lines are smooth. They end up creating the same outline, but I can tell there's more than just, it's a smooth texture. It's a smooth coat. That it's made up of many things. And it's just very simple lines. And I do highly encourage that you draw your body first. And let's say when you're drawing a bird has a big chest, like for instance a raptor or a chicken would. And a lot of birds will have like basically, the breast meat like round in here, especially chickens. You'll have this area. Well, instead of drawing that, it kind of gives you an idea. Where that divot is in a real bird, in the breast of the bird, I'll just go in there with these soft lines and follow basically, normally it appears as shading. Like so. And then when it comes to the wings, that's when you're going to need to look at the picture and study exactly where each feather goes. Maybe some of the feathers stick up just a little bit. And because these are bigger feathers, they're far more important. They're worth drawing in. You can see the individual feather in the wing area. You can't see the individual feathers in the body. So it's just a matter of using lines. Unless it's a textured bird, and then all bets are off. There, that looks a little better. Sometimes, in order to draw realistic, less is more. And I'll give you another example. When you're drawing a person's eye, unless the entire eye is in realistic size, so you are looking at about that much space. So unless you were drawing an eye this big or bigger, there is no reason to draw go in there with every single little eyelash. Top of her lid. Like so. Yeah. Getting a talking to. You never do eyelashes like that unless you are up close and it's this big. It never looks good and it's never going to work. But from a distance, what does work and what looks right, because, if somebody's standing 20 feet away from you, you can't count every single eyelash that's going on there. But from a distance, if you really want to imply that they have eyelashes going on, you just make that top line darker when it's small. Another thing you can do, and it looks cartoony, but when you're drawing something very small, it's enough. That's all you need is a little bit of line. Just doing something like that implies eyelashes. Rather than trying to, individual eyelashes. Just... Yes, I know, Pucky. So that is scales, feathers. That's a no-no. Now we are to fur. Now, fur is a lot like feathers, except we can get a lot more going on with it. And, one of the other things that you can do to imply a feather is making sure that you cut in every once in a while in the feather. We'll make a larger feather like these. Now, not body feathers. You don't want to do this with body feathers because that's too much detail. You normally can't see it. But for these longer feathers, you're going to end up with something a little bit more like this. You're going to want to cut in, showing bits and pieces, maybe overlapping with other layers, and so on. Okay. Fur ends up being a lot more about texture than anything. With feathers, if you put too much detail, everything feels heavy, and everything gets focused on the wrong thing. With fur, in order to show ripples and detail, these shorter lines, they're going to not be nearly as fluid and floaty like so, unless you're going for something that's a little bit more cartoony looking in the end. But for realism, it's just something that kind of looks like this. And it's just these short little quick lines. And sometimes, just like with the bird, where you draw the overall outline of where all the important stuff is, maybe where there's shading for like the breast part. Let's say there's an animal's ear here. The ear is back. So you're going to have the fur back here behind the ear, but then you may have an area where the fur changes direction and goes off in another way. And sometimes the fur gets longer. Maybe it was shorter behind the ear and it gets longer over here. Well, then just make longer lines. It's all it takes. And sometimes I'll come in and lay another layer over the top, and it may not match exactly what I did previous. That's okay, because now we're building layers. Now, we don't want to continuously, endlessly do that. We want to be describing something. Like, for instance, maybe there's a fur change direction right there. And that's pretty simple. I'll do it larger over here. So I got several pieces here, but they get shorter. It looks like what's actually happening is the fur is facing you, the viewer. And then I change the direction of it, like so. And now every line that I put down, especially when it comes to fur, has to describe the direction something's going. I'm not just putting lines down to fill an area, because it will always seem like you're just trying to fill the space. You do not want to do that. It will always be noticeable. When you're looking at something, well, let's see, let me give you, hopefully this will show up. Now let me see how much shows up. Okay. Every single line I put in here describes the direction that the fur is going. Even if it's going in the same direction. Well, it just changed direction just a little bit. Instead of going downwards, now it's going this way a little bit. I got fur coming from this direction and it's coming downwards. But now the fur back here, it kind of went another way. And in order to show shorter hairs along the face, it was just shorter marks, shorter lines. And some areas were darker, so I pressed down a little bit harder and made darker little lines. So let's say that eyebrow area, there's the eye. Just like so. It's just pat, 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 pat. A little bit like pointillism. And then sometimes those little pat, pat, pats are lighter. And then maybe one or two get a little bit dark. And maybe there's one random long one standing out in the middle of all of them. But I do not use an outline for anything. Like, I do in the beginning, but like, let's say, there, let's use her real quick. You can see that her outside is clearly lined. There is a clear line for her whole body. One, because of the style in which I'm doing this, I am doing it a little bit more on the cartoony side. And with a little bit more work, she's supposed to have a chameleon ability. So I'm playing with lightening up the lines so that way it looks like part of her's vanishing, and I think I need to take it up the tail a little bit more, yada, yada, yada. So this is looking a lot more cartoony because the lines going along the outside of her body are very, very dark. You want something to look more cartoony and more illustrated, you put dark lines around the outside. I lightly drew in my lines, but then I went in and turned all of it into fur. I got my basic idea, I got my rough setup. The only thing that's really lined in this is his claws. And you can see a little bit where it's been outlined. But I try to use very little of it, and it's never super dark. As a matter of fact, if I made it super dark, it would have blended in with the dark spots in his fur, where his fur did turn dark. So, which made it really great for me, because once I did line that in, you can't see it. You can't, or it's harder to see the lines. You have to be really in there and see that it's a line. Here again, to show shape a little bit more, I was nice, and it was soft lines, and then I built them up, and I built them up, and okay, well, a little bit down here because we're going down the neck, and I got my chin area. It's a lot easier on the fox to see. And we can see, especially along the brow here, you can't see a line anywhere in this. I did not put any lines, or at least I erased them once I got to this point. It's just little dots of varying darkness and grayscale. And then, because their hair gets longer, once you get off their face, those lines got longer, and then they got darker in some areas, and some areas are dark because of shadowing. So, but instead of smudging, like I was telling you guys, yeah, it was you guys, at the last meeting, I did not use a smudge stick anywhere, because if I did, that would get rid of all these lines, all these hairs that I painstakingly drew in, so that way you knew the direction the fur was going at all times. It gives a sense of depth. Instead of shading it darker in this area to show that it caves in right here, like there's a divot right there, I just drew darker lines. All it took. So, it's a little bit about the fur. If you want a really super detailed fur tutorial, I do have a video on my YouTube channel that is me drawing this that you can watch if you'd like. Just throwing it out there. Alright, and I believe that pretty much covers everything you guys requested of me. Fur, scales, feathers on bodies. I guess somebody said at some point face feathers. Face feathers are a lot like scales on the face. It depends on the individual animal that you're doing, that you're studying, that you're looking at, as far as how the feathers are on the face. A lot of animals, their feathers tend to be pretty monochromatic, usually one color, which there again, when we're drawing things in line, there's no need to draw each individual feather unless your bird's eye is life size. Kitten, we're talking this big, where you can actually see the individual feathers that are coming around. And that, trust me, that's not going to be any fun for anybody to draw. Yeah, kind of give you an idea there. Kitten! So yeah, that's pretty much, I guess a little body feather I can show you is, put a little thing there, and I make sure to leave space. I try to give it a feather shape where, it's basically, actually it's leaf shaped, with your line going through here, so got our line going through there. The short little fluffy feathers. Oh, he's going to tear up my whole room. Bad boy. Was a bad boy. So, there you have it. Scales, feathers, and fur for you guys to play with. I'd like to see you now use these ideas on your kobolds, and then send your kobolds to me. And I hope you guys had fun. I hope this was helpful. And if whatever it is that you decide to draw, even if it's not a kobold, trying to do these things, I would like to see you really use the concept and the idea of implied detail. Now, if you want to specifically focus on these specific techniques, I'm not going to fault you for it. Draw me a giant noodle, covered in fur, covered in feathers, covered in scales. Just like how I did this, but complete it instead of, me trying to quickly go through it. But if that's not what you're currently working on at the moment, that's fine. Show me the implied detail aspect using these kinds of things. So, I hope you guys all had fun. I hope you guys all learned something. And I will see you at the next FaceTime meeting. See ya!